Good afternoon, everyone. Look at this full crowd. This is exciting. Yay. Well, welcome to Who Knew. As you know, we're in for a treat because Susie is going to be interviewing Marion Cabell Chenault, and the title of their interview is Different People, A Shared Life. Ooh, so can only imagine what that's going to tell us. I know we are eager to learn more, but before we get started on that, I do want to let you know we will likely not have time for questions afterwards. However, the Chenaults have put a fabulous picture display in the back, so they'd love to invite you to look at their pictures afterwards, and I think you'll be there to chat with anyone and answer any questions on a one-on-one basis. So without further ado, I will turn it over and enjoy.
Thank you, Whitney. Thank you, Jordan, and thank you, Clay. We couldn't do this without you, and we appreciate you so much. It's good to see all those handsome and pretty faces out there. We're glad you're here. Marion and Cabell hardly need an introduction, but allow me to say that it has been a pure joy to sit around our dining room table and create this unscripted version of Who Knew for you. You're going to learn that the Chenaults are indeed different, unique individuals, yet they share some of the same passions, like the outdoors and adventure. They were a modern couple before modern couples became the norm, and they've both been pioneers in their selected professions. You'll hear about that too. They've lived exemplary lives, girded in faith and with the joint ministry of hospitality, a term coined by Marion. And a lot of us in here can attest to that too. We connected over a shared love of Greenbrier County, West Virginia. Marion went to Camp Allegheny for girls, the oldest camp for girls in the Virginias. And the Chenaults have been associated with Greenbrier Camp for boys for 118 years, almost since its inception. My family, my father's family, moved from Fauquier County, Virginia to Greenbrier County and settled there in 1804. So you can imagine how I bonded with them after hearing about how much they loved my home place. So sit back and relax and enjoy a peek into the life of one of Westminster Canterbury's favorite couples. Are we ready, kids? Both of you have credited your upbringings with having shaped who you are today. And Marion, those are two awfully good pictures of you. And I really don't think that sparkle in your eye and your spirit have changed at all. Can you talk to us a little bit about that, please?
Well, that's the first Santa Claus that I remember visiting was the original Santa Claus, I think, at Millen Roads. And here I am in elementary school. When anyone asks where my emotional home is, it's right here in Ginna Park. I grew up here. It's where I played. It's where I learned. I made friends. I learned really to be free and to have a wonderful time. The first house I remember living in was in Bellevue on Amherst Avenue. Mother, Daddy, and Carter and I moved in. And this is my sister, Carter Pollard, who's right there. And she is my leader. She moved to Westminster Canterbury, I think 11 years ago, but I'm not quite sure exactly how many. I went to, and if you're from Ginna Park, these will make sense to you. I went to Ms. Reed's nursery school, and then to Brook Hill, which was on the corner of Chamberlain and Azalea, and then to Ginna Park School. And I had a wonderful experience there at all of those schools and made some friends that I had. My oldest friend I made at Ms. Reed's nursery school, and he and his wife are still friends today. I think growing up in Ginna Park in the 50s was idyllic. We rode our bikes everywhere. We played in backyards. I remember making a camp out of the freezer box, the box the freezer came in, and we spent several summer nights out there. I went to Girl Scouts and Brownies, and Camilla Davis was in Brownies with me. I took piano lessons. I did choir. We played baseball right down the street on the corner of Wilmington and Brook Road. So for those of you who've been here, it was just a wonderful childhood. I spent my summers at Ginna Park Community Pool, and Laurie Rennie, who's a resident in the courtyard, taught me to swim. So I continue to have these fun connections to Westminster Canterbury. We moved to the West End when I was 12 and into the house that ultimately Cabell and I bought from my father after Mother had died, and we lived in that house for 37 years ourselves after Mother and Daddy had lived there for quite a while. I went to Albert Hill and Collegiate and graduated from Randolph-Macon Women's College a long time ago. So, your turn.
Well, I'm a Kentuckian. I'm sorry, I'm not from Virginia. Actually, my family is from Virginia because we moved to Virginia with Daniel Boone. But anyway.
From Virginia.
From Virginia, yeah, and into Virginia. Anyway, so I was born in Lexington, Kentucky. I'm a preacher's kid. I'm a middle child. I got all kinds of things, all kinds of strikes against me. Anyway, I do have an older sister who lives in Arizona, Mary Margaret, and younger brother Larkin who lives in Massachusetts. Marion talked about her emotional home. I have emotional homes. From the time I was probably 3 until I was 10 or 11, we lived in Mount Sterling, Kentucky. And Dad was minister of the church there and had wonderful times there, played baseball in the backyard. Our old stone Dutch oven was third base, and, but anyway, we had a wonderful, wonderful time. Best way I can explain what Mount Sterling was like in terms of size and number of people and that sort of thing is to talk about the fact that I can still remember what my telephone number was there. It was 995. 3 numbers. It wasn't a party line, but it was one of those things where you'd pick up the phone and the operator would say, "Number, please." And I would say 995 if I were out playing with my friends and I was calling to check in. And invariably, the operator would say, "John Cabell, Chenault, where are you? Your mother has been looking all over town for you." Small town, everybody knew everybody. 1954, we moved to Frankfort, the capital. Huge town. We moved from Mount Sterling to Frankfort, and I had to give up my dog because we were moving to a great big town with too much population and too many cars. When we moved into Frankfort, Kentucky, it was 17,500 people. That's big, but it's Kentucky. In any event, I said I had a second emotional home, and that was Camp Greenbrier. I am still going to Camp Greenbrier every summer. I just spent my 75th year there last year. Started in 1947, was a camper, then a counselor, and then for many years, when our children were going to Greenbrier and Allegheny, we would go to Camp Greenbrier for house party at the end of the regular boys camp. Then in 2008, my father came from Kentucky. My mother had died a couple of years before that. Moved in with us, and I knew that he had to go and direct a musical that he had started in 1944. And so I was going to take him up, and I called ahead and said to the people that I have known all my life, you have anything you can do to put me to work? I'm going to be bringing Dad up for the musical, and they put me to work, and I've gone there every summer since. Now, I think 13 or 14 summers where I have been assistant director of camp, head of the leadership program, and now I'm the Maine National Rifle Association representative. I teach riflery to the boys. So I love Camp Greenbrier, and you'll see we'll run into that as we go along. Go for it.
I was lucky enough to be sent to Camp Allegheny for girls, and it was the first time it was there that I met Cabell. He was coming over from Camp Greenbrier for boys to see his mother and sister. There were only 200 girls at the place, and he was 15 years old now. Anyway,
Thank you.
fast forward 3 years after Camp Allegheny, and I'm standing on the front porch of my dorm at Randolph-Macon Women's College. Oh, thanks. And this cute guy walks up, there he is, and says to the group, "Has anyone seen my sister, Mary Margaret Chenault?" And I said, "Yes, Cabell, she lives over there." It went completely over his head that I had called him by name, that I knew who his sister was, and that I knew where she lived. I should have picked up on something, but I'm not sure what it was. And from then on, whenever I'd see him on campus, I'd wave. I was dating somebody in Richmond, but I was delighted to know somebody, and so I'd wave to him. So anyway.
Fast forward 2 or 3 weeks, and I had tickets to go to a Peter, Paul, and Mary concert at UVA, and I was looking for a date. And I won't tell you how many times I'd struck out. But anyway, so I was in my sister's room saying, all right, here's this freshman Facebook, and who is this girl? And my sister said, well, that's Marion Smith. And I said, well, is she nice? And it just so happens that my sister didn't know Marion that well, but my sister's roommate had been Marion's orientation leader. And so she said, oh, yeah, she's a great gal, got a great personality, sews her own clothes. No, she didn't really say that.
No,
but anyway.
that's...
So my first date with Marion was to a Peter, Paul, and Mary concert. And it just so happens that a friend of mine, I was at Lynchburg College. I probably didn't tell you that, but in any event, being from Kentucky, I had promised my father always, my whole life, that I would go to Transylvania University in Lexington. But then I had gone up to see my sister at Randolph-Macon, and my friend Nancy Worthington, who owned Camp Allegheny, with whom I was staying, said, you really need to get a little further away from your dad. She was right. He lived 25 miles from Transylvania University. So she already had an interview lined up, and I went and talked to the folks at Lynchburg College and ended up starting there. And anyway, so a friend of mine from Lynchburg College had a Triumph TR3. I don't know if you remember that little sports car, but they had 2 very nice seats in the front and basically a board across the back, and you had to sit like this with your legs wrapped around the seat in front. That was Marion's and my first date. We're sitting on that board in the back because my friend had not gotten a date, and he sold his extra ticket to Mike Oler from Pennsylvania, who was the fullback. Anyway, so it was a little bit of a crowded thing, but we had a wonderful time. We held hands, and I'll just tell you, you know that Marion and I probably work at slightly different tempos. After we had dated for about 6 times,
6 weeks,
I kissed her, and she said, well, it's about time.
I didn't know you were going to say that.
Oh, you didn't? I'm sorry.
Well, then, I think that perhaps you decided to get pretty serious and you got married. Tell us a little bit about that, please.
We got married on June 24th, 1966. It was my 22nd birthday. It was my grandmother's birthday and her anniversary as well, and had always been a special day in the Smith family. It was special because of my Nana, not because of me. So, what happened?
What happened? My groomsmen handcuffed me to my mother at the reception. And this is my now 1 hour long father-in-law, her father, who was an ex-FBI agent, and he was trying to pick the lock, and the policeman was trying to help. And a guy that my father-in-law knew from the power company had run down to the power company to get some of those big chompers so they could cut things off by hand. Finally, my father-in-law caught up with two of my guys from Kentucky, just knowing that they're the ones that had done it. And they went back to the place where they knew that Marion's cousins had bought the handcuffs and bought another set, and we got out. So I didn't have to take my mother on my honeymoon.
That was good. 10 days after we got married, Cabell left for Cape May, New Jersey for Coast Guard boot camp. And the next time I saw him, he'd lost 30 pounds. He had his head shaved, and he was in a uniform that was amazingly like all the other people in the people marching by. I didn't recognize him, and I thought, oh my Lord, I've made a huge mistake. We are fortunate enough to have two children, Elizabeth, who's here, and John Cabell Chenault the fifth, JC. Our children are not only our friends, but they've been wonderful support, and we are very, very lucky to have them around. JC and his wife Joy have been married for 25 years now, and we have two children. They have two children, our two grandchildren, Cabell the sixth and Lacey.
We're not very original with men's names.
So,
did you mention Lacey?
Yeah, and Lacey.
Granddaughter.
Granddaughter. Your turn.
Well, speaking of children, you've both devoted much of your lives to children in different ways. Marion, I think you've made your profession in child development. You're still working. Would you tell us a little bit about that, please?
Well, I majored in science at Randolph-Macon, and I really thought I was going to be the great research scientist, or at least a research scientist. And my first job was at MCV in pulmonary physiology. And about 3 months into it, I realized that laboratories were not necessarily my cup of tea forever. And in January of that year, I thought, where can I do a quick interview? And I thought, okay, the most comfortable interview I could do would be at my old school. I didn't think I was going to teach. I'd never taken a class in teaching. And in January of 1967, I went to collegiate school and interviewed and was offered the job that day and started teaching 2 weeks later and loved it. And that has been my passion ever since. So I started at teaching 7th grade girls, middle school science. I moved from 7th grade girls to having children and doing tutoring and starting a tutoring agency where we had 150 tutors at the end who were working with children just as I had been working with children in the afternoons. And from there, with a friend, started Richmond Child Development Centers, which was a full-day program for children of working parents that had a very strong educational component. We started with 6 children in the September of 1982 and sold it in 2000. We had 3 houses on Elwood Avenue. We had 250 children and an absolutely great staff. Patricia placed it and Jerry Hand, who are both here, maybe here, maybe not, but they are at Westminster Canterbury, were two of the most innovative and grand early childhood educators that I've ever run across. I still see children that went to Richmond, RCDC, the Elwood House, and parents of children who went there. I retired for about 6 months, and 6 weeks, Elizabeth said, and got a call from the rector of our church, and he said, "Would you be interested in being the interim director at St. Stephen's Preschool?" And I said, "When?" He said, "In 5 days." I went, "Oh, okay." And I started a 19-year career there at St. Stephen's Preschool, which was a wonderful experience. And again, I have children and parents and teachers with whom I'm still in contact, and have loved my work with young children. So I think that's it.
Well, Elwood House was pretty much the genesis of most of the child development centers in Richmond, wasn't it?
There were not many at the time we began that had the educational component. So I think from that perspective, that's what we were able to add.
Yeah, that's so admirable. Well, I see a bunch of what look like Boy Scouts up here, Cabell. Can you tell us about your work with kids?
Yeah. Well, in fact, even before Boy Scouts, and I'll get to that, but Marion's teaching at Collegiate, we almost immediately started staying on weekends with children of her students, the parents of her students, while the parents went off, and things like that. We took a group of little girls to Virginia Beach one weekend, knocked on the door at 7:30 the next morning. They were in the room next to ours, and they all came and piled into bed with us. We took 6 14-year-olds to England in 1972 for a 3-week tour of England and Scotland, the Isle of Man, which was an interesting time. And we took the seniors from Collegiate. We chaperoned the seniors to Nassau. So we started right off doing a lot of travel-related kinds of stuff. I figured out somewhere along the way that I was never going to own Camp Greenbrier. And as a result, I still would go up there for summers and for a short period anyway, for house party, the family camp. But our son, decided that he wanted to join Scouts with some of his friends. And he asked me if I would go camping, because we had already done camping together. And so I all of a sudden found myself really into Scouts, having done it for Troop 1 in Frankfort, Kentucky years before. I now know there were a lot of Troop 1s, but anyway. So one of the things that I did after we got going with the Scouts, I started off with a troop of 7 boys. 15 years later, when I decided it was time to hang it up, it had 78 boys in the troop. But every 3 years, 1986, 89, 92, and 95, we would go to Maine. I was a canoeist from Camp Greenbrier. That's what I knew how to do. I could hike, but I really didn't particularly like to carry a backpack on my back and all that. So anyway, we took these trips where this is the very first one. Let's see if we can look at the next one. Yeah, here we go. Does that get everybody on there? Yep. This is an airplane called the de Havilland Beaver, which is a pontoon plane. And these are my 3 main guys. By the time we did our 3rd trip there, the Boy Scouts nationally had closed their main bases, but we had already done 2 trips by that time. And I knew that I had these 3 fellows who in this picture are probably 19 or 20. Ned Bothwell, my son's friend, whose mother, Peggy Bothwell, was here. Philip Grimes, whose mother, Anita Towell, is here. And then my son, J.C., were all very, very experienced outdoorsmen and knew the North Main woods and knew what we were into. We were there where we would attach our canoes to the pontoons of these planes. We would fly way back in, and 10 days later would come paddling out of the North Main wilderness. Many, many times we could go for 5 or 6 or 7 days without seeing another soul. And anyway, but it was a wonderful experience. We had 40 boys the year that this happened. And I had these guys with the boys. We always had an adult, a parent, but I could count on these guys. I couldn't necessarily count on the parent to know what to do, and these guys did know what to do. So anyway, that was a wonderful thing that we got to do.
There you are, I think, all the generations, 4 generations at Camp Greenbrier, right, Cabell?
This is Camp Greenbrier. That's actually me, my dad, and J.C. when he was 4 or 5 probably.
3.
3? Okay, 3. Over there is John Cabell, Chenault the 3rd, the 4th, the 5th, and the 6th. 4 generations right there. And we've all been to Camp Greenbrier. So, yeah.
And this is sort of a collage of the activities that you and Marion both do there, right, Cabell?
This is my grandson and me sitting out in front of a tent at house party time when all the adults are there. This is the men's chorus that my dad started in 1944. We sing an awful lot of the same songs that I get to sing with Bill Blake now, which is wonderful. From the teens, 20s, 30s, maybe even up to the 40s, but those are songs. And that actually is me directing it. Dad directed it for 60 some odd years, and in 2010 he had a stroke, and no, 2011 he had 10, that's right. And so he couldn't direct it. That was his last year, and I've directed it every summer since. But this is talking about herding cats, directing 19-year-old boys, at least half of whom are from Europe, from Spain or England or France or wherever. And sometimes they get to sing the solos. It's interesting hearing boys from France sing things like 5'2", eyes of blue, coochie 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 coo. Anyway, so these other pictures are on either end. That's Marion's office up there. Marion frequently will do work for her preschool back in Richmond, and so she has a computer set up and so forth. And then this is my father and my wife and me.
Well, on behalf of Greenbrier County and those of us who love it, we thank you.
Thank you. Been going there for a long time. My grandfather started there in 1908. Yes. That was my maternal grandfather, not a John Cabell. Anyway.
Terrific. Well, adventure and the love of outdoors is a shared passion. And Marion, I think you need to explain yourself on the front of that raft right there.
I'll build up to it. Because of our camp, both of our camp experiences, Cabell and I canoed a lot together, and I began canoeing with some women in Richmond, and we canoed on the James and on rivers around here, and ultimately, and we canoed at camp together at the family camp. Ultimately, we decided to take an expedition to the River of No Return in Idaho, the Salmon River, And Cabell didn't choose to go. He'd rather go with the Boy Scouts, so I went with my friends to the Salmon River, where we canoed and rafted for 5 days. The only way out of the Salmon River wilderness area is by water or by helicopter, emergency helicopter, and I'm proud to say that I got out on the water. So, but we had probably the adventure of a lifetime paddling the Salmon River, which is a wild water, and I loved it. While we were in West Virginia, we went to the West Virginia State Fair. And because I don't like to have any fun, and I'm really serious all the time, we bought purple tinsel wigs. And that fall, there was a charity raft race on the James, and the group of us who had bought the wigs together and some other friends that's me in the front with the sunglasses on, and all of us with our lovely wigs. We were certainly the prettiest people on the river, but we did not win the race. I will just tell you that. So that explains that one.
Oh, fabulous. Well, Cabell, you've done your share of outdoorsy things too. Can you tell us a little bit about what we're seeing here, please?
Well, this is my third best girl. My daughter and my wife are my best girls, but this is Emma. This was the last English setter that I had. I had English setters from the time JC was born up until this one died in 2019, right about the same time we sold our house. I hunted. I always heard my mother talk about hunting birds in Tennessee, and then all of a sudden I married Marion and found out that her father went hunting every single weekend in the quail season, and I got to go with him. So we hunted doves and quail and grouse in the mountains, and he had dogs and I had dogs, and that was just wonderful, wonderful life to live 13 weeks out of the year to go off and hunt. A lot of fun. The other pictures here, these are canoe races in West Virginia, the North Fork of the South Branch of the Potomac River, and that tells you how far up the creek you are. Couldn't canoe those streams without snow melted off the mountains, so we were frequently in wetsuits and never canoed probably much later than about March the 30th, but we would hunt January, February, or canoe January, February, March. This picture over here is me in my cycling togs, and the guy with me, Bob Wilson, it was from California, and he had a real expensive bicycle, and so he and I would pedal from our homes out on Patterson Avenue. We were both working for State Planners Bank at the time, and we would pedal together down there, but he always talked about wanting to pedal all the way across country. And I said, well, I probably am not going to take that much time because I'm going to go to camp at some point and other things. But we decided, my brother was getting married, and we decided we would pedal from Richmond to Frankfort, Kentucky for my brother's wedding. We didn't make it. His bicycle was so expensive and so exotic that when he had the ultimate flat tire of all flat tires, we couldn't get it fixed. But we did pedal from here to Huntington, West Virginia, before we had to call Marion to come pick us up. And that's what that's about. But anyway, hunting, a lot of fly fishing for trout up in the mountains, and that's my outdoor stuff.
You must have some strong legs, because that Route 60 is really
yeah, it is
curvy and
up and down,
and a lot of ups and downs.
Hawks Nest and Anstead and
yes,
Raynell,
and Raynell,
West Virginia. There you go.
That's where Susie was born.
Well, your cottage on the Rappahannock River has provided a backdrop for your priorities of family, friends, and fun. Could you give us a few of your favorite memories?
Well, we've always spent time in Middlesex County and Essex County because my mother was from the large town of Saluda, Virginia, and my father had a place at Waterview, Virginia. So we've always loved the Rappahannock River. And Dad had the opportunity to buy from his best friend, Louis Cruz, Lucy Lee's dad, our river cottage, which is a cottage, and it's in Jamaica. It's just in Jamaica, Virginia. It's not quite as elegant as you might think. And it is a cottage. And I say no matter the number of guests in the 650 square feet, we have a good time there. We play games. It's a place that until we ended up there during COVID, it is a place that had no TV. So we always played family games in the evening. We've done a lot of singing on our porches and had friends who rented nearby or lived nearby. Lucy Lee is 2 doors down from us, and it's been a place of wonderful memories. So,
how about that view, too? What a magnificent view you have from that cottage. Gorgeous.
My father would come to the river with us a little bit. He didn't like it too much because it wasn't his thing, but he would call it the lake because the river is 3.5 miles wide there.
Oh, beautiful. Do you have a favorite memory, Cabell?
Oh, Gad, there are too many. One of my very favorite is, I mentioned before, Ned Bothwell, who was one of the boys that went with us. But one of my real close friends, Peggy Bothwell, who taught with Marion at Collegiate. Peggy and I would sit out on the porch on Sunday mornings, because obviously being in Jamaica, we weren't going to church, but we would sit out on the front porch and talk about theology and our Christianity and that sort of thing. So wonderful experiences that.
Well, faith has always been important to both of you. And as Marion aptly said, our ministry is hospitality. And yet, you both were called in different directions. Marion, what are your thoughts on your faith walk?
Well, I've always been part of the faith community and have found myself doing a lot of organizational things on building community. I took religion was my minor in college, and so I did a lot of, I think I would call myself a seeker still.
Interesting. And Cabell, how about you?
Well, like I said, I'm a preacher's kid. I sort of left the church alone a little bit right after college. Just for a short while, but I sort of always kept in touch. Marion and I, when J.C. came along, decided that we really thought he should go to church, and then when Elizabeth came on later, and we went to 7th Street Christian Church because that was a Christian church, Disciples of Christ church, which was my father's denomination, and we were there, and actually at one point, when our minister left, Wayne Light, another resident here, and I were on a pulpit committee together to call a new minister. Did that. Some years later, we had some issues in the church that just sort of undid me, and Marion and I started looking around and ended up going one Sunday to St. Stephen's Episcopal Church, where we ran into Jan and Al Orgain and Nan and Lyle Hall and others, and we decided, this is a friendly place and we like these folks, and so we've been there since 1984 or so, I think. I've done an awful lot of small group kinds of work. The Episcopal Church has a curriculum called Education for Ministry, which I did for 8 years. Started off with Caroline Brandt and others in that. Had a wonderful 8-year run in that where I mentored the group for 4 of those years. And then the fellow from St. James Church with whom I co-mentored that group, and I did a interesting thing that I had run across. It was called the Summer School for Religious Studies at Oxford University in England. And we went there for a 2-week study with a bunch of octogenarian. Can you imagine anybody being that old? Octogenarian professors from Oxford. And not to be too overly serious about it, we spent 2 weeks doing that, and then we went to the south of England and fished on the Test River, which is one of the magnificent chalk streams. So we did a little trout fishing for a week. But anyway, so that was fun. I do like to travel. Early on, and actually while I was still doing the Scouts, one of the associates at St. Stephen's, and I started talking, and he recommended a book that I might like, and I read Matthew Fox's The Coming of the Cosmic Christ. I liked that. Ended up doing a number of things along that line, but we started at St. Stephen's a Lenten retreat where we would go to Shalom House out in Hanover County with no more than 30 people, because that's all it would take. Our rector would recommend a book for us to read. We would all read that, and we would go, and for a long weekend, we would have his lectures, and then we would break up into small groups and discuss what he had preached about or taught about. And he was a wonderful, wonderful teacher. Through all of that, I followed the sort of progressive theology things like the Jesus Seminar, read a lot of Marcus Borg. I like the titles of these books. Sometimes I don't remember everything I read, but anyway, there was a book written by a fellow by the name of Robin Myers, Saving Jesus from the Church, How to Stop Worshiping Christ and Start Following Jesus, which pretty much sums up my theology, I think, which is that Jesus taught us an awful lot of wonderful things that I believe in.
Well, Cabell, we all enjoy your voice, and yours too, Marion. But your parents were classically trained musicians, and didn't you sing for Robert Shaw at one time?
Well, yes, in a way. I sang, Nan Hall and I sang together in a chorus of alumni and friends of the University of Richmond. Ruth Erb's husband, Jim, was our director. He was a wonderful, wonderful conductor. And when the Richmond Symphony was asked, had asked Robert Shaw to come up and direct Beethoven's Missa Solemnis, Robert Shaw said, "Well, if you get Jim Erb to prepare a chorus for me, I'll come up and I'll direct that." Robert Shaw was at the Atlanta Symphony, but the Robert Shaw Chorale, which went on much before that. My dad had sung with him. In any event, so Jim Erb prepared the chorus. We had a practice. Our first practice with Robert Shaw was at PSCE down the street here, and I stood much closer to Robert Shaw than I am to you, singing in his face. Talking about intimidating, it really was. But my father had sung with him before, and I'd heard a lot about him, and it was a wonderful experience. Mother and Dad were classically trained singers, and as a result, I stood in their shadow and didn't really always want to do that. So But I do love music, and I love to sing.
Well, we sure thank you for what you do for us, musically especially. Well, neither of you has ever really retired, but you were brilliant when you developed what you called a gap year. That is a geriatric action plan. We should all do that. They made that up. I thought that was really brilliant. And you've traveled extensively. We're seeing a couple of pictures here. There are going to be more on the table that people can look, but you've been just about every place that you could go, and you're still planning more. Tell us a little bit about this, please.
When I retired from St. Stephen's, we knew we wanted to come here, but we also knew we weren't quite ready. And so we decided to travel for that year. It was September 2019, so the year didn't quite end up the amount of time that we'd expected. But what we did was we had the first 2 weeks, 3 weeks planned, and we bought a rail ticket and started traveling. We would make plans while we were one place for where we would go the next place. We did have one set of very distinct plans to go to the Cotswolds, and we traveled with our friends, Mac and Joan. We spent 7 weeks together in the Cotswolds and traveling together. And we met our family in Garmisch and then took off. We just would go places. We did some house sitting where we would go and stay in someone's home while they were traveling. And I think one of the best places we ever went, aside from Stowe, was Sevilla, and we loved Seville and being there. We were in Antibes in March, and a woman walked in, and she had her cell phone. We were in a tiny little restaurant, and she announced to the 12 of us who were in the restaurant. She said, "Oh, Macron has just closed all public buildings and all restaurants in France officially tonight."
Midnight tonight.
So we thought it was time to come home. And part of our story is that we and I guess many of us thought that if we spent 2 weeks separated and if we spent 2 weeks isolated, that everything would be fine. So we decided that the best thing not to contaminate our children, because we'd been traveling near places where there'd been a lot of discussion about COVID. We went to the river. We intended to stay for 2 weeks. Luckily for us, there was an escapee from Westminster Canterbury who arrived the very same day we did, and Lucy Lee Cruz and Cabell Chenault and Marion Chenault spent 8 months on the Montague Island in Jamaica, Virginia, at our cottages. We were a pod there. We had not intended that quite like it happened, but it did happen that way. So it was great. It taught me a lot. I learned a lot about just chilling
and surviving.
Yeah.
Yeah, this trip was sort of planned and sort of not planned. Example, we went to Portugal and Spain for about 8 or 9 days with our friends from camp, and they came back, and we knew we were going to go to a place in Scotland. We went there. We decided after the 4 or 5 days that we were there that we would go back to Inverness, where we had arrived by train to rent a car to go down to this place. And we went back to Inverness. We hooked up with a group to go out and see the Isle of Skye. And, we were just sort of winging it. And then it was, okay, we're going to have to leave Scotland. Where do you go? And I've never been to York. Let's go to York. So we got on the computer and we found an Airbnb that we could stay in for 4 or 5 nights. And we did that. Went to York, had a wonderful, wonderful experience in York. And while all this is going on, we're also, we left, well, before York, we went to Edinburgh and ran into a fellow who had been at Camp Green, one of these international counselors from Camp Greenbrier. We ran into there and had dinner with him one night. Ran into a fellow who'd been on my rifle staff just a couple of years before at Sheffield University as we were going back across to the Cotswolds in England. And the Cotswolds was one of the planned things that we did. We were going to live in a cottage in the Cotswolds for 8 weeks. And Marion spent a good part of the summer before that finding just the right place. So we did that. But we went through the Channel 4 times, back and forth to Paris. We went from Paris to Seville. All of this on the train, and much of it just, planned 2 or 3 days ahead of when we headed out. So we did end up buying a Ural pass around the 15th of March, which we had to turn in because we had to come home. And when it was time to come home and the lady came into the restaurant and said everything's closing in France, we went back to our apartment that night and looked at the television, and the customs hall at Dulles was absolutely packed, back to back and belly to belly, as they say. And I said, Marion, we're gonna catch this whatever it is, because nobody really knew what it was. And when we arrived less than 48 hours later, on the 17th of March at 7 o'clock in the evening, there were no more than 15 people in the customs hall because nobody was traveling anymore. So we were lucky.
Yeah. Memories. Well, as we close, I'm looking at some familiar faces up here, and that leads me to ask, what motivated you guys to come to Westminster Canterbury?
We were very fortunate to develop a group of friends with whom we shared weddings, funerals, children, adolescents, our children's adolescence. We had a lot of shared experiences, and we, as a group, because of sharing the process of aging parents, decided that we would come to a continuing care community. And so as a group of 10 of us, we came to Westminster Canterbury and several other continuing care retirement communities as a group. I imagine we may have been one of the very few groups of 10 people who ever came through the sales department as a group of 10. Whoever had the privilege, and I don't remember who it was, had the privilege of showing us around everywhere from a studio apartment to the biggest in the courtyard. We saw it all. And out of the 10 of us, 9 of us came. One was had died before we came, and the rest of us have all been here. So this was not a group choice when we made it, but we had put our money down here in 2006, and we came in 2020, right?
November the 11th.
2020.
Yep.
So this was our choice, and the part I would say is that we have shared a journey with some really good friends. We have made lots of friends along the way, and we feel like we're still making them there, and we really appreciate the people who are sharing the journey with us now. So that's part of our story.
Well, we are so glad you're here and for all that you add to our community. And we can't thank you enough for being so generous with your time and telling us about your life. It's been fabulous. And thank you so much.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much. And I can't wait to do some research on Camp Greenbrier. So
That's right,
Google,
unique.
I'm going to be Googling a whole lot after this. But we loved hearing everything and seeing the pictures. And there's wonderful pictures in the back that I hope you all look at. And before we adjourn, I do want to let you know that our next Who Knew is going to be April 5th. And at that one, Ann Archer will be interviewing resident Paige Chargois. So mark your calendars for that. And how about another round of applause? Thank you so much.